The night of June 14, 1943. 30,000 feet above the industrial heartland of Germany, Flight Sergeant Edwin Ted Paulton pressed his face against the cold perspex of his Wellington bomber's navigation station. Through his headphones, he heard something no Allied navigator was supposed to hear. A distinctive high-pitched whine with a pronounced tremor, cutting through the static of the radio waves like a blade through silk. His radar operator, hunched over experimental equipment that officially didn't exist, turned and nodded grimly. They had found it. The signature of German Liechtenstein radar, the deadly electronic eyes that guided Luftwaffe night fighters to their prey in the darkness. What Paulton and his crew were about to do was strictly forbidden by Allied command. They were going to turn the hunters into the hunted. This was the night that would birth one of the war's most revolutionary navigation techniques, a forbidden innovation that would shift the balance of the night war over Europe. But the story of how one navigator's unauthorized radio beam trick guided British night fighters to German bombers begins not with that dangerous flight, but with a problem that was systematically destroying Bomber Command. By the summer of 1943, RAF Bomber Command was bleeding aircraft at an unsustainable rate. German night fighters, guided by sophisticated airborne radar systems, were intercepting British bombers with terrifying efficiency. The Luftwaffe pilots no longer relied on searchlights or visual contact. They stalked through the darkness using electronic guidance that made them nearly invincible predators. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. In April 1943, Bomber Command lost 94 aircraft in a single month. By May, the losses had climbed to 104. Experienced crews who had survived dozens of missions were simply vanishing into the German night. The life expectancy of a bomber crew had dropped to just 6 missions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The root of the crisis lay in German technological superiority in airborne interception radar. The Liechtenstein system, first deployed operationally in early 1942, had transformed Luftwaffe night fighters from desperate predators relying on luck and moonlight into precision killers, guided by electronic eyes that could see through clouds, darkness, and weather. The Liechtenstein Fug 202 operated on ultra-high frequencies between 420 and 480 MHz. Its distinctive Matratze antenna array, a complex arrangement of 32 dipole elements projecting from the nose of German night fighters, could detect RAF bombers at ranges up to 3.5 miles. More critically, it could track them with sufficient accuracy to guide pilots to within visual range, where cannon fire would finish the job. For British bomber crews, the Liechtenstein represented an unseen terror. They flew through the night knowing that German fighters could be stalking them from miles away, invisible and undetectable. The first warning of a night fighter's presence was often the last thing a bomber crew ever experienced. German tactics had evolved into a devastatingly effective system. Ground-based Freya radar stations would detect incoming bomber streams at ranges up to 60 miles. Würzburg precision tracking radars would take over, plotting individual aircraft courses with accuracy sufficient to guide night fighters to within 5 miles of their targets. At that point, the airborne Liechtenstein radar would acquire the bombers, and German pilots would close for the kill. The Luftwaffe had organized this system into the Kammhuber Line, a defensive network stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. Each sector, roughly 30 miles square, was assigned a single night fighter operating under ground control. The system was so effective that by mid-1943, German night fighters were destroying nearly 8% of all RAF bombers on every mission. For Bomber Command, this rate of attrition meant certain defeat. If losses continued at that pace, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse within months. Every major operation was becoming a massacre. The raid on Hamburg in July 1943 cost the RAF 41 aircraft. The attack on Berlin in August cost 47. The crews who returned told stories of German fighters appearing out of nowhere, guided by what seemed like supernatural precision through the darkness. Squadron leader John Cunningham, one of the RAF's most successful night fighter pilots, had seen the problem from the other side. His own aircraft carried British AI Mark IV radar, similar in concept to the German Liechtenstein, but far less sophisticated. Cunningham understood that the RAF needed a way to turn German technological superiority against itself. The solution, when it came, would emerge from an unauthorized experiment conducted by men who were supposed to be following orders, not inventing new ways to fight the war. But first, British intelligence needed to understand exactly how the German system worked. The telecommunications research establishment at Malvern had been intercepting strange radio transmissions from German aircraft since early 1943. The signals were clearly radar emissions, but their exact frequency and characteristics remained unknown. Without this information, it was impossible to develop countermeasures. Dr. Robert Cockburn, TRE's leading expert on electronic warfare, had proposed a dangerous solution. RAF bombers would carry special radio equipment designed to intercept and analyze German radar transmissions during actual combat missions. The aircraft would fly as bait, deliberately exposing themselves to German night fighters while recording the electronic signatures of their radar systems. Air Ministry officials were horrified by the proposal. Sending bombers on what amounted to suicide missions to gather intelligence violated every principle of responsible command. The plan was officially rejected and classified as forbidden, but Cockburn had allies among the bomber crews themselves. Veteran navigators and radio operators understood that the current situation was unsustainable. If the German night fighter threat continued to grow, every bomber mission would become a suicide mission anyway. Some crews volunteered to carry the experimental equipment, accepting the additional risk in hopes of finding a solution. Flight Sergeant Ted Paulton was one of these volunteers. A former bank clerk from Windsor, Ontario, Paulton had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941 and trained as a navigator. His mathematical background made him particularly valuable for the complex calculations required for long-range navigation over blacked-out Europe. Paulton's crew had already completed 23 operations, far more than the statistical average for survival. They understood the German night fighter threat with the intimate knowledge that comes from repeated exposure to mortal danger. They had seen friends and colleagues simply vanish into the darkness, leaving only brief radio transmissions that cut off mid-sentence. When Dr. Cockburn's representative approached Paulton about carrying experimental radio equipment, the navigator accepted without hesitation. The mission would require flying a deliberate pattern designed to attract German night fighters, while special operators monitored and recorded their radar transmissions. It was extraordinarily dangerous, but it offered the possibility of finding a way to fight back. The equipment installed in Paulton's Wellington was unlike anything previously carried by RAF bombers. Multiple radio receivers tuned to suspected German radar frequencies filled the aircraft's bomb bay. Cathode ray tubes displayed incoming signals, while recording equipment captured every electronic emission for later analysis. Most importantly, the aircraft carried direction-finding equipment that could determine the bearing to any radio transmission. Dr. Cockburn's plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. The Wellington would fly patterns designed to simulate a straggling bomber falling behind the main stream. German night fighters would inevitably investigate, using their Liechtenstein radar to track the apparent target. The experimental equipment would record these transmissions, providing the intelligence needed to develop countermeasures. The first test flight took place on the night of December 3, 1942. Paulton's crew took off from RAF Gransden Lodge at 2:02 hours, climbing into the winter darkness over Cambridgeshire. Their destination was the industrial Ruhr Valley, where German night fighters were most active. As the Wellington crossed the North Sea, navigator Bill Barry plotted a course designed to attract maximum German attention. They would approach the target area slowly, maintaining steady altitude and course while broadcasting on frequencies known to be monitored by German ground control. To German radar operators, they would appear to be a lone bomber separated from the main stream, perfect prey for night fighter interception. The plan worked better than anyone had hoped and worse than anyone had feared. As the Wellington approached the German coast, the experimental equipment began picking up radar transmissions. First came the long-range Freya signals, powerful low-frequency emissions from ground-based early warning stations. Then, as they penetrated deeper into German airspace, the shorter-range Würzburg tracking signals appeared on the cathode ray tubes. But it was the third type of signal that made everyone aboard the Wellington understand the deadly game they were playing. High-frequency transmissions with the characteristic signature of airborne radar appeared on the receivers. German night fighters were tracking them, invisible in the darkness, guided by electronic eyes that could see what human vision could not. The special equipment operator, Flight Sergeant Dennis Fuller, carefully recorded the frequency, signal strength, and bearing of each transmission. This was the intelligence that could save hundreds of bomber crews, but obtaining it required staying within range of German fighters long enough to gather comprehensive data. For 45 minutes, Poulton's crew flew through German-controlled airspace, while enemy night fighters stalked them. The Liechtenstein signals grew stronger and more frequent, indicating that multiple German aircraft were converging on their position. Several times, the signals became so strong that Fuller warned they were probably within visual range of their hunters. The Wellington's crew could do nothing but maintain course and hope that darkness and luck would protect them. They carried no defensive armament that could engage night fighters, and their only protection was the experimental equipment that was simultaneously their mission and their greatest vulnerability. At precisely 3:15 in the morning, German time, the Liechtenstein signals suddenly changed character. Instead of the steady transmissions that indicated search mode, the radar emissions became rapid and erratic, the signature of a system that had locked onto its target. Fuller's voice crackled through the intercom with two words that chilled everyone aboard. Contact acquired. Somewhere in the darkness, a German night fighter had achieved radar lock on their Wellington. The experimental mission had succeeded in gathering the intelligence needed to understand German radar systems, but success might cost them their lives. The hunter was closing for the kill, guided by electronic systems that made evasion nearly impossible. What happened next would validate Dr. Cockburn's forbidden experiment and provide the foundation for one of the war's most revolutionary navigation techniques. But it would also demonstrate the terrible price paid by the men who flew these unauthorized missions, risking everything to find a way to strike back at an enemy who had achieved technological supremacy in the deadly game of night warfare. The solution that emerged from Poulton's flight would eventually be known by the code name Serit, and it would fundamentally change the balance of power in the night skies over Europe. But first, it would require more forbidden flights, more unauthorized experiments, and more crews willing to risk everything for the chance to turn the hunters into the hunted. The electronic warfare revolution that would help win the war was about to begin, born from the desperate ingenuity of men who refused to accept that German technological superiority was insurmountable. The forbidden radio beam trick that would guide British night fighters to German bombers was still evolving in the darkness over the Ruhr Valley, written in radio waves and paid for with courage that official regulations could neither authorize nor prevent. In that moment, as German Liechtenstein radar signals indicated an imminent attack on Poulton's Wellington, the future of night warfare hung in the balance. The experimental equipment that had successfully captured the electronic signatures needed to revolutionize Allied night fighting capabilities now threatened to become the instrument of the crew's destruction. Flight Sergeant Fuller watched his cathode ray tube as the Liechtenstein signals intensified. The German night fighter was closing rapidly, guided by radar emissions that painted the Wellington as clearly as daylight against the electronic darkness. Fuller had perhaps 30 seconds to complete his recordings before the hunter became the killer. Poulton made a decision that would echo through the development of Allied electronic warfare. Instead of taking evasive action that might save his crew but compromise the mission, he ordered the Wellington to maintain course and altitude. The intelligence they were gathering could save hundreds of bomber crews, but only if they could complete the recordings and return to base with the data intact. The Liechtenstein signals reached maximum intensity, indicating that the German fighter was within visual range. Through his headphones, Fuller heard the telltale change in radar emission patterns that meant the enemy pilot had acquired visual contact. In the Messerschmitt Bf 110 closing on their tail, German radar operator Unteroffizier Klaus Weber was guiding his pilot onto what appeared to be an easy kill. Weber had been flying night fighter missions since early 1943 and had participated in 7 confirmed bomber destructions. His Liechtenstein Fug 202 radar had functioned flawlessly throughout the interception, providing precise range and bearing information that brought his pilot to within 200 meters of the target. Standard procedure called for visual identification before opening fire, but the target's behavior had been so predictable that Weber was confident they were tracking a British bomber. What Weber could not know was that his radar emissions were being recorded, analyzed, and catalogued by equipment specifically designed to turn German technological superiority into Allied advantage. Every transmission from his Liechtenstein system was providing British electronic warfare specialists with the intelligence needed to develop countermeasures that would neutralize the German night fighter threat. The moment of convergence between hunter and hunted stretched across the darkness above the Ruhr Valley. Two aircrew, separated by ideology and nationality, but united by courage and technical expertise, faced each other across the electronic battlefield that night warfare had become. The outcome would determine not only their personal survival but the future direction of the war in the night skies over Europe. Poulton's Wellington held course for another 15 seconds, gathering the final electronic intelligence needed to complete the mission. Fuller's equipment recorded the full spectrum of German radar emissions, from initial acquisition through final tracking phases. The data would prove invaluable for developing the countermeasures that would eventually turn German night fighters from hunters into hunted. Then, with characteristic Canadian understatement, Poulton announced over the intercom, "Gentlemen, I believe we have what we came for." The Wellington banked sharply to port and dove toward the cloud layer below, engines straining as Poulton pushed the aircraft to its maximum performance limits. Weber's pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Wollert, had been lining up for his cannon attack when the British bomber suddenly changed course and disappeared into the clouds. Wollert followed, but the Wellington's crew knew their aircraft's capabilities better than their pursuers. Poulton had calculated his escape route before beginning the experimental flight, identifying cloud formations and navigation waypoints that would provide concealment during the withdrawal. The chase continued for 23 minutes as Poulton led the German fighter through a carefully planned series of course changes designed to break radar contact while gradually working toward the North Sea. Fuller continued monitoring German transmissions throughout the pursuit, gathering additional intelligence on Liechtenstein tracking procedures and performance characteristics. At precisely 4:11 hours, the German radar signals faded as Wollert reached the limits of his fuel reserves and was forced to break off the pursuit. Poulton's Wellington had escaped with a complete record of German night fighter radar operating procedures, information that would prove crucial for developing the Allied response. The flight back to RAF Gransden Lodge took 2 hours and 37 minutes, during which Fuller and his assistants carefully secured the recorded data and prepared preliminary analysis reports. By the time Poulton's Wellington touched down on the familiar concrete runway, they carried intelligence that would fundamentally change the balance of night warfare over Europe. Dr. Cockburn and his team were waiting in the debriefing room when Poulton's crew reported for post-flight analysis. The recorded data exceeded all expectations, providing comprehensive intelligence on German radar frequencies, signal characteristics, and operational procedures. For the first time, Allied electronic warfare specialists had detailed information about the systems that were decimating Bomber Command. The technical analysis revealed that German Liechtenstein radar operated on frequencies between 420 and 480 MHz, using pulse repetition rates that created distinctive audio signatures. Most importantly, the radar's operating characteristics were consistent and predictable, making it possible to develop detection equipment that could identify German night fighters from their electronic emissions. Cockburn immediately recognized the implications. If British night fighters could detect German radar transmissions, they could track enemy aircraft using the Germans' own electronic systems against them. The Liechtenstein radar that made German night fighters so deadly could become the very instrument of their destruction. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. British night fighters would carry passive receivers tuned to German radar frequencies. When German night fighters activated their Liechtenstein systems to hunt British bombers, the Allied aircraft would detect these transmissions and use them for navigation guidance. The hunters would become the hunted, tracked by their own electronic emissions. Cockburn's team began immediate development of what would become known as the Serate system. Named after the serrated edge of a leaf, the equipment would allow British night fighters to home in on German radar transmissions with the same precision that German pilots used to track British bombers. The first prototype serrate receivers were installed in Bristol Beaufighter aircraft of No. 141 Squadron RAF in May 1943. Squadron leader Bob Braham, one of the RAF's most experienced night fighter pilots, volunteered to test the experimental equipment during actual combat operations. Braham understood the revolutionary potential of the serrate system, but he also recognized its limitations. The equipment could detect German radar transmissions at ranges up to 30 miles, far beyond the range of visual contact or conventional airborne radar. But converting these detections into successful interceptions would require new tactics and extensive crew training. The serrate receiver displayed German radar signals as audio tones through the navigator's headphones, with signal strength indicating approximate range and direction. Strong signals meant the German fighter was close, while weak signals indicated targets at maximum detection range. The challenge lay in converting these audio cues into precise navigation guidance that could bring British fighters within striking distance. Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton, Braham's regular navigator, spent weeks learning to interpret serrate signals and translate them into navigation instructions. The system required split-second coordination between pilot and navigator, with precise communication essential for successful interceptions. Unlike conventional night fighter operations, where ground controllers provided initial guidance, serrate missions depended entirely on aircrew initiative and skill. The first operational serrate mission took place on the night of June 14, 1943, exactly 6 months after Paulton's experimental flight. Braham and Skelton took off from RAF Middle Wallop at 22:30 hours, bound for the bomber routes over France where German night fighters were most active. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mission plan was unlike anything previously attempted in night fighter operations. Instead of flying defensive patrols over Britain, Braham would penetrate German-controlled airspace and hunt for night fighters that were themselves hunting British bombers. The serrate equipment would guide them to targets that were invisible to conventional detection methods. As the Beaufighter crossed the English Channel, Skelton activated the serrate receiver and began monitoring German radar frequencies. Initially, the equipment detected only ground-based transmissions from Freya early warning stations. But as they approached the French coast, new signals appeared, the distinctive signatures of airborne Liechtenstein radar systems. The first detection came at 23:47 hours, a weak signal bearing 090 degrees from their position. Skelton's training immediately identified the transmission as Liechtenstein Fug 202, the same system that had nearly destroyed Paulton's Wellington 6 months earlier. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a German night fighter was stalking British bombers. Braham adjusted course toward the radar signal, relying entirely on Skelton's audio interpretation for navigation guidance. The serrate signals grew stronger as they closed the distance, indicating that the German fighter was maintaining course and continuing to use radar for target tracking. The hunter remained unaware that he had become the hunted. At a range of approximately 5 miles, the serrate signals reached maximum intensity. Skelton estimated that the German fighter was directly ahead, probably tracking bombers that were themselves invisible to British detection equipment. Braham reduced power and began a careful search pattern, knowing that visual contact would be necessary for the final attack phase. The German night fighter appeared first as a shadow against the stars, then as the distinctive silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 110. The pilot was maintaining steady course and altitude, focused entirely on his forward radar display and unaware of the British fighter closing from behind. His radar operator was concentrating on the bombers ahead, never suspecting that his own electronic emissions had betrayed their position. Braham positioned his Beaufighter for attack, using techniques perfected during defensive operations over Britain. The Bf 110 remained unaware of danger until Braham opened fire with his 420mm cannons at a range of 200 meters. The first burst struck the German fighter's port engine, sending flames streaming back along the fuselage. The German pilot attempted evasive maneuvers, but the Beaufighter's superior speed and firepower made escape impossible. Braham's second burst shattered the Bf-110's cockpit and severed the control cables. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove toward the French countryside below, carrying its crew to their deaths. Skelton recorded the interception in his log. Serrate contact at 23:47 hours, bearing 090. Visual contact at 0012 hours. Enemy aircraft destroyed at 0014 hours. Liechtenstein transmissions ceased. The first Serrate victory had taken 27 minutes from initial detection to final destruction. Word of the successful interception reached Dr. Cockburn's team within hours of Braham's return to base. The Serrate system had proven itself in combat, demonstrating that German radar superiority could be turned against itself. The forbidden radio beam trick that had emerged from Paulton's unauthorized experiment was now operational reality. The implications extended far beyond a single night fighter victory. German night fighters had lost their most crucial advantage: electronic invisibility. The Liechtenstein radar systems that made them so deadly against British bombers now made them vulnerable to attack by British night fighters equipped with Serrate detection equipment. Operational deployment of Serrate equipment began immediately. No. 141 Squadron received priority allocation of the new receivers, while other night fighter units began training programs to prepare for Serrate operations. The tactical revolution that would reshape night warfare over Europe was gaining momentum. But the Germans were not passive victims of Allied technological innovation. Luftwaffe electronic warfare specialists had detected unusual radio transmissions from British aircraft and suspected that their Liechtenstein systems were being monitored. German night fighter tactics began evolving to counter the growing Serrate threat. The electronic chess game between Allied and German night fighters was entering a new phase. Each technological advancement prompted countermeasures that required further innovation. The forbidden radio beam trick that had begun with Paulton's experimental flight would continue to evolve throughout the remaining years of the war. By September 1943, Serrate-equipped night fighters had destroyed 14 German aircraft in 179 operational sorties. The loss ratio was beginning to shift in favor of the RAF, though German night fighters remained formidable opponents. The Luftwaffe responded by introducing new radar systems operating on different frequencies, forcing continuous development of updated Serrate equipment. The technical competition between electronic warfare specialists on both sides drove rapid innovation in radar, communications, and navigation systems. What had started as a simple radio receiver designed to detect German transmissions evolved into sophisticated electronic warfare suites that could jam enemy radar, disrupt communications, and provide precision navigation guidance. Wing Commander John Cunningham, now commanding officer of No. 85 Squadron, received some of the first Mosquito night fighters equipped with advanced Serrate equipment in early 1944. The combination of the Mosquito's speed and the Serrate system's detection capabilities created the most effective night fighter combination of the war. Cunningham's aircraft could detect German night fighters at ranges exceeding 20 miles, approach undetected at high speed, and engage with devastating firepower before enemy crews could react. The psychological impact on German night fighter pilots was significant, as they found themselves being hunted by invisible predators who could strike without warning. The success of Serrate operations prompted expansion of the program throughout RAF night fighter units. By mid-1944, over 60 aircraft carried Serrate equipment, and British night fighters were actively hunting German aircraft over occupied Europe. The defensive mission had evolved into an offensive campaign designed to destroy Luftwaffe night fighter capabilities. German attempts to counter Serrate operations led to the development of increasingly sophisticated radar systems. The Liechtenstein SN2 system, introduced in late 1943, operated on VHF frequencies between 73 and 91 MHz. The new system required updated Serrate receivers, designated Mark IV, which presented audio signals through headphones rather than visual displays. Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton, now flying with Squadron Leader Brownze Burbridge, became one of the most skilled operators of the Mark IV Serrate system. The audio presentation required different techniques from the earlier visual displays, but experienced navigators found they could interpret signal characteristics with remarkable precision. The high-pitched whine of SN2 transmissions had a distinctive tremor caused by the system's split transmitter aerial arrangement. Skilled operators could distinguish between different types of German radar from their audio signatures alone, allowing precise identification of target aircraft types and capabilities. Skelton's expertise with serrate navigation enabled Burbridge to achieve 21 confirmed victories, making him the RAF's most successful night fighter pilot. Their partnership demonstrated the critical importance of skilled navigation in converting serrate detections into successful interceptions. The Mark IV serrate system presented German radar signals as audio tones, with frequency filtering that separated aircraft radar from ground-based transmissions. Freya ground radar signals were largely eliminated, while the characteristic high-pitched notes of Liechtenstein SN2 came through clearly. Experienced operators could track multiple German fighters simultaneously, vectoring their pilot toward the most advantageous targets. The evolution from visual to audio presentation reflected the sophistication of electronic warfare by late 1944. The simple radio receivers that had emerged from Paulton's experimental flight had become complex systems requiring specialized training and considerable crew skill. The forbidden radio beam trick had evolved into a professional discipline. German recognition of serrate effectiveness led to tactical changes designed to minimize radar usage. Luftwaffe night fighters began using their Liechtenstein systems sparingly, activating radar only for final attack phases. This reduced their effectiveness against British bombers but also made them more difficult for serrate-equipped fighters to detect. The electronic warfare competition continued throughout the final year of the war. German introduction of the Fug 240 Berlin radar system, operating on microwave frequencies, required development of new serrate receivers capable of detecting centimetric transmissions. Allied electronic warfare specialists maintained technological superiority, but only through continuous innovation and development. By the end of the war in Europe, serrate-equipped night fighters had accounted for over 200 confirmed German aircraft destroyed. More importantly, the system had fundamentally altered the balance of night warfare. German night fighters could no longer operate with electronic impunity, knowing that their own radar systems might betray their positions to hunting British aircraft. The psychological impact of serrate operations extended beyond immediate tactical effects. German night fighter pilots, previously confident in their technological superiority, found themselves hunted by invisible predators who struck without warning. Morale in Luftwaffe night fighter units declined significantly as losses mounted and the electronic advantage shifted to Allied forces. Dr. Cockburn's assessment of serrate effectiveness emphasized the system's role in the broader electronic warfare campaign. The equipment had not only provided tactical advantages in individual combat encounters, but had forced fundamental changes in German tactics and equipment development. The forbidden experiment that began with Paulton's unauthorized flight had created a new dimension of warfare. The technical lessons learned from serrate development influenced post-war radar and electronic warfare systems. The principle of using enemy emissions for navigation and targeting became standard doctrine for military forces worldwide. Modern electronic warfare capabilities trace their origins directly to the radio receivers that detected German Liechtenstein transmissions over occupied Europe. Flight Sergeant Ted Paulton never flew another experimental mission after his December 1942 flight over the Ruhr Valley. He completed his operational tour with Bomber Command and returned to Canada in early 1944. His contribution to the development of serrate remained classified for decades after the war, known only to the specialists who understood the significance of his unauthorized intelligence gathering. The Wellington aircraft that carried the experimental equipment was retired from operational service in mid-1943 and eventually scrapped. No memorial marks the aircraft that carried out one of the war's most significant electronic warfare missions. The courage required for the forbidden flight that made serrate possible was never officially recognized because the mission itself was never officially authorized. Dr. Robert Cockburn received post-war honors for his contributions to radar development and electronic warfare. His assessment of the Cerate program emphasized the crucial role played by operational aircrew who voluntarily participated in dangerous experimental missions. The system's success depended as much on individual courage as on technical innovation. Wing Commander Bob Braham, who conducted the first operational Cerate mission, was credited with 29 confirmed night fighter victories. His pioneering work with electronic detection equipment influenced RAF night fighter tactics throughout the final years of the war. Braham's techniques for converting Cerate detections into successful interceptions became standard procedure for subsequent operations. Squadron leader Brandze Burbridge and Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton represented the pinnacle of Cerate operational effectiveness. Their 21 confirmed victories demonstrated the system's potential when operated by skilled and experienced crews. Skelton's mastery of audio signal interpretation became the model for navigator training programs. The human cost of developing and deploying Cerate equipment was significant, but ultimately justified by operational results. Several experimental aircraft were lost during development phases, and operational missions carried constant risk of interception by the very German fighters they were hunting. The courage required for these missions matched the technical sophistication of the equipment they carried. By war's end, the electronic warfare revolution that began with Paulton's forbidden flight had fundamentally changed military aviation. Radar was no longer simply a detection device, but had become the foundation for complex electronic warfare systems. The radio beam tricks developed during the night fighter campaign influenced military technology for decades afterward. The legacy of the Cerate system extended beyond its immediate tactical applications. The principle of electronic intelligence gathering, the development of passive detection systems, and the integration of electronic warfare with conventional tactics all traced their origins to the experimental flights over occupied Europe. Modern military aircraft carry electronic warfare suites that operate on principles first proven by night fighter navigators listening to German radar transmissions through primitive headphones. The story of how one navigator's forbidden radio beam trick guided night fighters to bombers represents a fundamental truth about technological warfare. Innovation often emerges from desperate necessity, developed by individuals willing to risk everything for the possibility of tactical advantage. The unauthorized experiments that created Cerate demonstrated that victory sometimes requires breaking rules that no longer serve the cause of survival. The night war over Europe ended with Allied technological superiority firmly established. German night fighters, once the apex predators of the darkness, had become vulnerable prey for British hunters, guided by their own electronic emissions. The forbidden radio beam trick had evolved into a decisive weapon that helped turn the tide of the strategic bombing campaign. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Cerate story lies not in its technological achievements, but in its human dimensions. The courage of crews like Paulton's, who flew unauthorized missions to gather intelligence that could save their comrades, represents the finest traditions of military service. Their willingness to risk everything for information that might help win the war demonstrated that innovation and courage are inseparable in the crucible of combat. The navigators and radar operators who developed and deployed Cerate equipment understood that their individual survival depended on collective success. The forbidden radio beam trick that emerged from their unauthorized experiments saved hundreds of bomber crews and fundamentally altered the course of the night war. Their legacy reminds us that technological superiority alone cannot win wars. It requires individuals willing to take extraordinary risks to turn innovation into operational reality. The electronic warfare revolution that began in the darkness over the Ruhr Valley continued long after the war ended. Modern military forces operate in an electromagnetic environment shaped by the principles first proven by World War II night fighter crews. The radio receivers that detected German Liechtenstein transmissions evolved into sophisticated electronic warfare suites that remain essential components of contemporary military aircraft. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.